Hey, Maude, have you ever heard the term false social reality?
No.
Well, it's kind of important for today's topic.
Which is?
Climate change.
That seems like a super real, very scary reality that we're all facing. But do tell, Adam.
Okay, so last year, researchers at Yale found that a supermajority of Americans, almost 80%, support public policy to combat climate change. And we're talking about big, bold things like a carbon tax or a national mandate for renewable energy. And that support also comes from both Republicans and Democrats. It's bipartisan. But here's the thing. A follow-up study led by a Boston College researcher asked Americans if they think other people, their friends or family or the other people in line at the grocery store, were in favor of climate change policy. And they discovered that we assume that only 40% of our fellow citizens actually support it.
So let me see if I've got this straight. Nearly 80% of us actually want to see government action to counter climate change. But we think the number of Americans who care about this issue is much lower, like around 40%?
Exactly. Thus, the phrase false social reality. As the researchers put it, false social reality could, quote, lead people to falsely conclude that a vocal minority who dismiss climate change are representative of broader public opinion.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Definitely a chance. Welcome to Green Flags, the podcast about the quest for a better business model, one that puts humanity at its core and helps companies become more profitable in the long run.
I'm Maude Standish, a futurist and innovation consultant and executive producer at Odd Media.
And I'm Adam Fetcher. I have a history of helping companies define their values and turn them into meaningful action. And I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Public Engagement for New Belgium Brewing Company.
So, as Adam just mentioned, we're searching for the green flags that represent a more humanized approach to business. And what could be more important for a company's bottom line or their reputation than saving all of humanity from the existential threats caused by climate change?
Yeah, because if your customers are threatened and your coworkers are threatened, then your business is threatened as well. Climate change is already destroying people's homes and lives. I mean, just think about the devastation from Hurricane Ian last year. And all this helps to explain why most Americans really do support major investments in climate solutions, despite what we might assume. And while there are certainly a growing number of bright spots and some real success stories, the levers of power, specifically corporate America, have frankly been far too slow to move. So, here's the big question for us today. Is there any way for one employee to tip the scales and get their company to embrace climate action and advocacy?
Spoiler alert, the answer is yes. And you don't have to be in the C-suite to do it either.
But first, before we get to climate change, let's step back for a moment. Everyone gather around for story time. You too, Maude.
You know I love a good story. So what's this one about?
The cautionary tale of Kodak.
The camera company?
Exactly. And our story starts in the mid-1970s, when Kodak was basically the Beyoncé of the camera industry, pumping out hit after hit after hit. That's when Kodak camera sales accounted for 85% of the market. But back then, you had to put a roll of film in your camera, then send that film off to a lab before you could even see your photos.
Adam, I'm a child of the 90s. I'm familiar with the concept of old school cameras.
Duly noted. And not for nothing, but Kodak sold 90% of all the film that went into those old school cameras. Then, in 1975, one of Kodak's own engineers, a guy named Steven Sasson, developed the first ever digital camera. It was as big as a toaster, and frankly, the quality of the photos wasn't great. But obviously, this was a serious breakthrough. So tell me, can you guess what Kodak executives thought about this digital camera?
Well, you said this is a cautionary tale, so I'm guessing they hated it.
And you would be right. Kodak was making tons of money selling film rolls, so the execs thought, why would we ever want to develop a filmless camera? Steven Sasson later said Kodak's reaction to his invention was basically, quote, "That's cute, but don't tell anybody about it."
Well, that did not work out for them, did it?
Yeah. Fast forward to 2012, when the Eastman Kodak Company had to file for bankruptcy. Wah, wow.
Definitely a cautionary tale. So, what's our takeaway?
Well, sadly, if I had to sum up the typical business model for corporations, even today, it's not that much different than how Kodak responded. Because companies tend to favor short-term gain, even if it puts them at risk of long-term pain.
Ouch, that's a harsh read of corporations.
Yeah, but it's true. Over the past several decades, most publicly traded companies have been pushed by their investors to focus on just one thing: how to create the biggest profits right now, rather than invest in things that will pay off down the road.
That seems about right. Tell me a little bit more about this long-term pain you speak of.
It can be lots of things. Failure to innovate because you're so focused on maximizing profits for the products you already sell. It could be failure to invest in new technologies that would save you money in the long run, but cost millions, if not billions of dollars up front.
Yeah, pretty sure investors don't like to hear about billion-dollar hits to the bottom line, even if it could solve a future dilemma.
Sure, but let me give you just one example of how long-term strategy really can pay off for a company. In 2014, CVS Health removed cigarettes from its pharmacy shelves. This was done as part of CVS's overall mission to help people on their path to better health. In the short term, it cost the company $2 billion a year in lost revenue, and its stock value dropped 7% the day the tobacco ban was announced. But this action also helped CVS earn the trust and the extra business of healthcare providers, who started referring more patients to CVS. And by aligning closer to its mission, CVS was able to boost its reputation with employees and attract more top talent as a result.
But today, we're not going to talk about the health crisis of smoking. We're focused on an even bigger crisis, one that might just cost us our very existence on this planet. We're talking about climate change.
Because when it comes to investing in climate action and embracing climate advocacy, companies have a clear choice. They can be like Kodak and focus on short-term profit, or they can be like CVS and focus on long-term benefits.
And here is where I'm going to drop in a quick reminder that this series is focused on the needs that drive human motivation.
And to do that, we're slowly climbing up the steps of a theoretical pyramid known as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It helps us better understand the world around us so we can make the most impactful decisions to help ourselves and the companies we work for.
And today, we're talking about the second step of Maslow's theory, safety needs. Because when we don't feel safe, we get anxious. And Lord knows I don't need any more anxiety in my life.
And what better way to calm your nerves than to know there's actually something you and I can do about our current climate predicament?
And there's a strong business case for why companies should embrace long-term investments in climate action.
I work in cryptocurrency, which is an industry that's been derided for its negative externalities with regard to the environment and with regard to climate.
That's Catherine Champagne. She's a marketing manager for a company called Rainbow Wallet. And don't worry, you don't need to be a crypto expert to follow along.
Whew, well, that's a relief to hear because I am certainly not.
And apparently, neither are the people in crypto. But what's important to know is that most types of cryptocurrency rely on a multitude of computers to independently keep track of and verify transactions. Each crypto transaction is thought of as a block, and it's all organized in a virtual ledger system known as blockchain technology.
Validating transactions on a blockchain can be very energy intensive.
Right. Because each crypto transaction is verified many, many, many times over using tens of thousands of high-powered computers all over the world. You've probably heard of Bitcoin miners, but you might have no idea what they actually do. Well, Catherine explains that they get a small reward of Bitcoin every time they help to keep track of this virtual currency.
All these Bitcoin miners, what they're doing is they're working really hard to solve computer problems, basically, to validate the transaction.
But all that computing power requires a lot of electricity. Bitcoin transactions, for example, are said to use more electricity each year than some small countries.
So there's sort of always been this lingering shadow on cryptocurrencies being very negative for the environment. Like, oh, Bitcoin, is boiling the oceans.
According to Catherine, there's a lot of nuance to this criticism. And frankly, she thinks that the media's portrayal of Bitcoin can be over the top sometimes. But she's also really glad to be involved with a company that focuses on a different cryptocurrency called Ethereum.
Ethereum used to work this way too, but they very recently underwent this process that they called the merge. And so instead of all these really energy intensive computers running 24/7 to validate transactions on the network, instead you have a system where people with skin in the game basically put up some of their cryptocurrency to be validators and earn the rewards.
In other words, instead of having every single computer in the network attempt to verify every cryptocurrency transaction, Ethereum randomly selects a small group of trusted users to handle the verification.
So what does that mean for our good friend, Mother Earth?
Well, the improvement is actually pretty insane. The merge is expected to cut Ethereum's energy consumption by more than 99%.
Major green flag.
Yep, but don't get too excited just yet. After all, Mother Earth has taken a lot of hits in the past few decades.
The climate crisis is a man-made, slowly unfolding crisis, and we're already seeing serious impacts around the world.
That's Bill Weil. He worked as the director of sustainability for Google and then became the green energy czar for Facebook. How does he know there's a climate crisis? Well, some days he just looks out the window.
I live in San Francisco, and wildfires have always happened in California, but for the last several years, they've been more common and more intense. And the smoke from these fires has made the air unbreathable, sometimes for weeks at a time.
We should point out that Bill currently has a health issue that impairs his speech, so we have a voice actor reading Bill's responses from our interview with him. Bill says, while some people think of the climate problem as being something super remote, it's actually right here in our backyards. And it's not always just out of control wildfires. There are more droughts, more intense storms, more flooding. These weather-related disasters are costing the United States an eye-popping $400 million per day.
We know scientists have directly linked the climate crisis to human activity. And we know it's caused by emissions of greenhouse gases, mostly carbon dioxide, but also gases like methane.
To solve it, we need to cut emissions to zero, and at this point, we need to do it very quickly.
Bill says the companies already have most of the technologies needed to transition to a zero-carbon economy. But more importantly, he says, many studies show that there's a big financial upside for businesses that invest in climate solutions. In other words, they can actually save money by buying clean energy, by investing in energy-efficient production lines and office buildings, or by electrifying their fleets of vans or trucks. Let's remember, good policy, on which corporations have a ton of influence, can further incentivize these investments, as well as make markets more fair by penalizing companies that lag behind. So, why the heck isn't more of this already happening?
During my 12 years at Google and Facebook, I saw the enormous impact companies could have working on climate solutions. But over time, I saw how the loudest business voice was obstructing progress on climate policy.
And the loudest voice with the most red flags? You guessed it, we're talking about gas and oil companies.
The fossil fuel industry has an interest in maintaining its current revenue streams, so they'd like us to keep driving gasoline vehicles, they'd like us to keep burning gas in our buildings, and just keep up life as we've known it, and hope someday we can remove all that carbon.
But Bill says there's another culprit to blame for climate.
It's also the big trade associations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, and the National Association of Manufacturers.
Each of these trade associations represents a huge swath of companies. The Chamber of Commerce, for example, has more than 3 million members.
Those powerful associations lobby hard against climate policies, and they spend millions of dollars on ad campaigns in swing states and swing districts to try to influence lawmakers.
not surprisingly, means it's harder for one company to move the needle.
I came to realize that all the work my colleagues and I were doing inside Google and Facebook, while really important and impactful, wasn't delivering the progress we need at the speed and scale required.
And there are specific goals in place to help solve the climate crisis. In 2015, the United States signed on to an international climate treaty called the Paris Agreement. It legally binds countries, more than 150 of them, to cut emissions in half by 2030 and to zero by 2050. That means emissions from gas engines or coal-fired power plants, or hell, the methane produced by raising cows and pigs, has to drop to zero in the next 27 years.
And that's why Bill created his own nonprofit called Climate Voice. It urges companies to go all in on climate, both through their business practices and how they lobby the government for new policies.
But Bill isn't focused on reaching out to company leaders, at least not directly. Instead, he wants to teach individual employees how to push their companies to take stronger steps forward.
At many companies, the competition for talent is one of their biggest issues, especially for engineering and management positions. And young people today are overwhelmingly passionate about and worried about the climate. So if you want to hire and retain talented young people, you better have a good story about how you're engaging with the climate crisis.
So how exactly do employees mobilize in order to use their collective voices?
First, I would say it's not easy, but you can make a huge difference. And then I would suggest they find a small group of colleagues who also care deeply about the climate issue and are willing to organize and be internal advocates for change.
And here's why you and your coworkers might want to advocate internally for climate action. This is about making the business stronger and more resilient. It's also about representing coworker and community interests, and it's about helping the company build a reputation as a climate leader, which is super valuable. All things that any ambitious employee might want to contribute. But before you act, Bill says you need to get educated.
Most people don't know what their company lobbies for or when their company chooses to stay silent. And they really don't know what trade associations their company belongs to and what type of lobbying those groups do, because some of the worst obstruction comes from powerful trade associations.
And once you assemble a group of coworkers and educate yourselves on the issues, then what's the best way to share your concerns with management?
Raising those issues privately with the chief sustainability officer at your company may get you a polite hearing, but not much movement. We've had some employees describe the first response they get as the parade of awesomeness, as in, oh, we're doing all we can on policy, which is rarely actually true, or look at these 20 cool things we're doing, which is usually a misdirection tactic. But the key thing is to be persistent and to come back with specific examples where the company could engage but isn't. Also, look at where your company's trade associations are obstructing climate policy in the name of your company and with your company's money.
And if you've tried to backchannel your concerns about an employer's climate policy and you're still getting nowhere, Bill suggests adopting a more public strategy.
You can also raise these issues at a company town hall meeting because, in my experience, that forces the executives to explain their actions in front of the entire employee base. And if the executive's answer is, we don't like to take sides, they'll likely find that many employees aren't happy with that answer. And we've seen that kind of feedback turn into real movement by the company within a few days.
Wow. Well, Bill is obviously an incredibly accomplished person, and it's just amazing to be able to talk to him, somebody who has such a depth of experience inside enormous companies about both the influence that businesses can have and the power that individual employees can have internally. What do you think, Maude? What did you hear from the conversation with Bill?
You know, Adam, I think for me, it all comes back to this term that you taught me today, this idea of false social reality. The thing is, we're all sitting here and we all want to make change, but we're nervous that we're the only ones that want to do it. What I keep coming back to and listening to this is that if we could just break down this false social reality, that we alone are the people that care about making sure that the earth is still here in the next 50 years or 2,000 years, then maybe we can band together and truly make work a place where we work together, not just on making profit, but on also protecting the planet.
It's so true. I mean, I think companies, big businesses in particular, are really used to and good at, frankly, sort of pushing back or plugging their ears when they hear noise being made about actions that, people think they should take from the outside. Big companies are, frankly, they're under siege on a lot of fronts all the time. And so they just become used to sort of turning away and ignoring it. But companies, even big companies, are not immune. In fact, it's the opposite. Internally, coworkers really have a voice. I mean, especially we live in an age now where 9 out of 10 American workers are saying that they would rather work in a company that fits their values over one that pays them more. I mean, that really says something powerful about both kind of the direction of the American workforce and the importance, if you want to attract top talent, for companies to listen to employees and engage them in meaningful conversations about issues like climate change. And I think coworkers, they have this really unique point of view, right? I mean, every company has a climate story or a sustainability story. It's just kind of table stakes. But a lot of that is frankly greenwashing. I mean, there was an incredible Harris poll that came out maybe a year ago that said almost 70% of C-suite leaders in large U.S. businesses admit, when they're asked privately, anonymously, they admit that they're guilty of greenwashing. But from the outside, it's often, frankly, hard to tell. And, consumers certainly don't have a lot of extra time to do the research and decipher whether a company's statements around climate action or sustainability are legit. But employees who are on the inside, they're perfectly situated to be able to know the difference and to be able to call companies out in ways that don't have to embarrass the business, right? This can happen on the inside. The press doesn't need to know, etc. It's a way to make progress without damaging the company by building a whole public campaign around it.
I mean, I would just have to totally agree with you. I think one of the things that was really inspirational for me is that you feel like these problems are so much bigger than you, and then the organization is so much bigger than you. And so as an individual employee, you keep thinking, well, what power do I have in this situation to solve anything? But the power isn't as simple as just saying something. It involves organization. It involves getting people together and really utilizing them to empower individual employees to make a real difference across an organization and hopefully across the world. But it doesn't mean that we all have to do it from step one in pure perfection. It doesn't have to be all about damage control. It can be about the progress we're all making together.
I think that is such a good point, Maude. I mean, one thing that we've worked really hard to do at New Belgium is exactly that. Let's embrace the fact that, making progress on solutions to the climate crisis is hard. It's incremental. It's small step by small step. And every tiny step you make forward does make that next step just a little bit easier. And that's what real progress looks like. There's no silver bullet when it comes to climate change. And I think, Bill's reminder that we have to keep pushing always. You can't have a big win. We saw this with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? When it passed, a lot of people kind of took a deep breath and said, whew, all right, we did it. And you know what? Even a step as big as the Inflation Reduction Act is ultimately just one small step in the right direction in solving this truly enormous problem.
So we've talked about what employees can do to push corporate leaders for climate action, but what can company executives do on their end to help?
From the fact that I have 2 kids, I had to devote myself to trying to bend the arc of capitalism towards better outcomes.
That's Ken Pucker. He's the former chief operating officer for Timberland, the footwear brand known for its iconic boots.
It's insane that we continue to spoil the planet and risk system collapse, but the system in which actors operate actually motivates that kind of behavior, I think.
Remember when I said investors focus almost exclusively on short-term profits when it comes to a company's quarterly earnings reports? Ken explains why.
The average hold time for an investor is often measured in months, not years. And the average tenure for a CEO is measured in years, but less than 5. And so it's hard for investors in that context or executives in that context with the incentives as they are to think in 25-year terms.
Ken says he was lucky to be the COO of a company that did have a long-term outlook.
Timberland was publicly traded, but the Schwartz family had 10-to-1 voting rights, so they controlled decision-making.
At that time, in the early 2000s, Timberland's CEO was Jeff Schwartz, the third generation of his family to lead the company.
And in the third generation, Jeff's principal contribution was to change the mission of the company from being just a product-obsessed company to one that was equally obsessed with what he called commerce and justice. And justice at Timberland included three components: global human rights, citizen service, and environmental stewardship.
Environmental stewardship showed up through a number of initiatives. Timberland installed one of the largest solar power arrays at the time in California. It powered all of its factories with renewable energy, and it was one of the first companies to issue a quarterly report on sustainability.
Nowadays, most companies do give quarterly updates on sustainability practices, things like water usage or carbon emissions. But Ken says it's usually a bit of a smokescreen.
The engine of capitalism operates on the oxygen of growth and the output of profit, and everything else is really ancillary. And I think we've mistaken reporting for disclosure and disclosure for action or change. Reporting in the U.S. on non-financial or sustainability factors is voluntary and typically unaudited. And as a result, companies can cherry pick the information that they present, and they can also choose not to present on certain metrics or present partial information.
The way Ken tells it, even Timberland was guilty of this partial reporting, even though its heart may have been in the right place.
When I was there the last 7 years, we committed to reduce our carbon emissions by more than 10% a year. We did. We reduced them by 15% a year over a 7-year period while the company grew. And you think to yourself, wow, wouldn't it be cool if more companies did that?
Ken says at the time, it was too difficult for the company to keep track of what's known as Scope 3 emissions, which include everything from supply chain operations to employees' daily commutes to business travel.
So Scope 3 emissions, which are all upstream and downstream emissions, that's 96% of our footprint. We didn't know if emissions went up or went down.
Even as reporting methods and metrics continue to improve, Ken admits it'll be difficult to get every company on board.
And so on a measurement item that's really existential, we haven't even gotten to full disclosure. And when we do get to full disclosure, the question is, will that change behavior?
So, Adam, as we wrap this fascinating and, for me at least, empowering episode, what have we learned about climate change and how it factors into the search for a humanized way of doing business?
Well, first let's look at the red flags when it comes to the relationship between business and the climate crisis. And let's be honest, there are a lot of them. Number one, we know that the climate crisis is bearing down on us. It's not just a future problem anymore, it's happening right now. And it's not just hurting us as individuals or as communities, it's hitting businesses like a Mack truck at 70 miles per hour. And yet, it can be hard to feel that impact because the crisis moves so slowly. But it's real, like trillions of dollars real. In fact, climate change will cost the U.S. economy $14.5 trillion in just the next several decades if we don't take sufficient action. Another red flag? 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions can be traced back to just 100 companies.
I've heard that before, and every single time it blows my mind.
Me too. I just can't get over it. And perhaps the biggest red flag of all is that far too few of the biggest companies are taking real action. Now look, there's been a lot of impressive movement in some areas of business toward adoption of climate strategies. Hundreds of companies have set greenhouse gas emission targets in line with climate science, established renewable energy goals, and adopted legitimate carbon neutrality programs. But nearly 2/3 of Fortune 500 companies still lack a real climate action plan. And less than half of big company execs say they have the tools to even measure their emissions, let alone work to reduce them.
That literally is so crazy, especially given how often we see companies marketing green products and making all these sustainability claims.
Exactly. And that brings us to our next red flag. As we said earlier, greenwashing is a big problem. It creates confusion in the marketplace, which means when you or I walk into the store hoping to vote with our dollars and support a brand doing real work to fight climate change, It's nearly impossible to sift through all the nice-sounding phrases and logos and whatever else they're doing.
And who has time to do a ton of research every time you want to head out for a Target run?
Not me. And this is a big part of what I do for a living. Okay, our final red flag. As Bill told us earlier, we know that the best route to making real progress on climate means enacting strong climate policy at all levels of government. It's a big green flag that Congress passed the biggest piece of climate legislation in history last year. But the red flag occurs when we all sit around and celebrate, instead of working on the next one, and the one after that. Because we're gonna need a whole lot more.
Okay, but we also need a little bit of celebration every now and then to get us going and keep us doing it, right?
Of course. Let's all do a little dance for the Inflation Reduction Act.
Is there such thing as doing a dance on a podcast? If so, I'll make a note for that on season 2. Picture me wiggling.
That sounds way more fun than solving the world's biggest problems, right?
Definitely.
Okay, all right. Let's review some of the green flags we dug up. First, as we heard from Bill Weil and Ken Pucker, there is an airtight business case to be made around the financial payoffs of investing deeply in climate solutions and staying competitive in the future economy. The companies that spend money now to fund things like electric vehicles and regenerative agriculture will produce, mark my words, will produce the greatest shareholder returns in future decades. And they'll be able to stay ahead of competitors in places like China that are frankly moving a lot faster than us. Also, as a communications guy, I'd be remiss not to mention that there's a lot of reputational value to be had for companies that truly lead the way on climate. Okay, second green flag. Although the environmental crisis often seems huge and impossible, individuals can have an impact. After decades trying to make companies more sustainable from the top, Bill Weil has committed himself to helping employees assert our influence in changing the way companies think about climate from the inside.
Bill suggests getting organized with like-minded coworkers and getting smart. Business leaders care about the business case, so make a strong one.
Finally, if you don't mind, I'd like to steal a green flag from my experience at New Belgium. As our CEO, Steve Fetchheimer, often says, if you don't have a climate plan, you don't have a business plan. And I think our story is really unique. So, New Belgium has been working to reduce our impact on the planet for more than 30 years. More recently, we've doubled, if not tripled down on our response to the growing urgency of climate change through what I call a 360-degree approach. What does that mean? Well, at New Belgium, we look at every tool at our disposal and then deploy it to help support the climate movement. This includes things like reducing our emissions all the way back to raw materials, investing profits back into high-impact regenerative agriculture and renewable energy projects, donating millions of dollars to frontline climate groups, lobbying for climate policy at the federal, state, and local levels, sharing everything we've learned openly with other businesses, including competitors, making our flagship beer, Fat Tire, America's first carbon-neutral beer, and using our marketing channels to mobilize beer drinkers to join us in taking action. Because if you didn't know, beer itself is under threat from climate change. And now you know.
And now I'm scared. I don't want to lose beer and the world with it. And the thing is it seems like most companies, if they're doing anything at all, stop at their own emissions. But there's so much more business can do, especially consumer brands, if we think creatively and if we make it a priority to stay in business for more than the next few years.
Exactly.
Well, for our final green flag, I want to try to end on an optimistic note. Because the reality is, despite the need for so much more in every sector, the world is moving more quickly on climate change than we sometimes realize. Consumers and coworkers want to align themselves with brands that lead on climate change. This creates market forces and competition that support more sustainable innovation, as long as we clamp down on that greenwashing. And climate has also become a top voter issue, especially for young people.
Oh, man, that certainly gives me a lot of hope in a situation that's been frankly pretty hopeless. And the hope is that we can keep electing leaders who will continue to work to enact serious climate policies and not just stop with the Inflation Reduction Act.
And another hopeful thing is that renewable energy costs have gone way down. which further strengthens the returns companies can get by transitioning now.
That is really good news. And as you said, there's quite a lot of it.
And for a final pep talk, let's go back to Bill Weil.
None of us can do everything, but I view it as yes and. It's climate improv. We need everyone to use whatever influence they have. You can drive less, buy an electric vehicle, put solar on your house, eat a more plant-forward diet, and of course vote, with climate as a key issue. And remember, employees have a lot of influence on their employers, so I'd put employee activism at the top of that list to ensure we build on the positive momentum of the Inflation Reduction Act and accelerate climate action even faster.
Every time I listen to Bill, it just warms my heart. His points are always so spot on.
At the end of the day, humans face an existential threat from climate change. We all know that. But as we search for a humanized approach to business, which is what this podcast is all about, it seems like the path is clear for companies to find greater financial success precisely by doing more to save humanity.
And on the note of saving all of humanity, I think we can call it for the day. What do you think, Adam?
I think we've landed the plane, so to speak, solved all the world's problems.
Well, at the very least, we've ended this podcast, and hopefully we'll see you guys at the next one.
Thanks for listening to Green Flags. I'm Adam Fetcher.
And I'm Maude Standish, and let's make the world a better place.
See you later.
Hi, I'm Brent Radke, and I've been a coworker at New Belgium Brewing since 2005. I serve as a food safety specialist in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I'm here to give credit where credit is due. Green Flags is a co-production of Odd Media and New Belgium Brewing. This episode was written and produced by John Hawes and Maude Standish with help from Adam Fetcher. Post-production for Green Flags is provided by Talented Friends Incorporated with original music and sound design by Jason Reimer. Our executive producers are Maude Standish, Russell Sansgary, Adam Fetcher, and Sean Belangi. Our communications guru is Megan Olson. Creative support from Zoe Evanitis and Kelsey Ireland. Special thanks to those who lent their voices to this episode, including Catherine Champagne, Ken Pucker, and Bill Weil. Thanks also to Dana Kelly, Abby Zarnecki, Laura Smith, Celine Wright, Steve Fetchheimer, and all the coworkers of New Belgium Brewing. You can find Green Flags on Spotify, Apple Music, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.